He pulled a stranger from a wreck in a Montana blizzard, kept her alive through the night, carried her to safety through zero-visibility snow, then walked into work the next morning and found her sitting at the head of the table, holding the pen that would end his career. The woman he saved was the CEO sent to fire him, and she didn't know yet that stopping her would cost him everything he had left. If stories like this hit different for you, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when it matters most, subscribe to this channel and follow every part to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The thing about Montana winters is that they don't warn you twice. The first warning comes in October, when the sky turns the color of old pewter and the wind off the Rockies starts carrying something mean inside it, something personal, like it knows exactly where you live and exactly how thin your walls are. By January, that warning is long gone. January in the Flathead Valley isn't a weather event. It's a reckoning. Ethan Calloway knew this the way he knew the ache in his left knee or the particular creak of the third step on his porch. Not as information, but as part of the body. He'd grown up 50 miles east of Kalispell, in a town small enough that the only stoplight had been a point of civic pride. He'd left at 19, joined the Navy, done things in places with names most people couldn't find on a map, and come home at 32 with a wife, a 3-year-old daughter, and a particular kind of stillness behind the eyes that the people who knew him best had learned not to ask about. The wife was gone now. 4 years gone. It wasn't the kind of gone that came with anger or blame. It was the kind that came with a 2-lane highway and black ice and a semi whose driver hadn't slept since Billings. It was the kind of gone that left a man standing in a hospital corridor at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, listening to a doctor explain things in careful sentences, while somewhere in the pediatric ward his 3-year-old daughter was asking a nurse where her mother was. Ethan Calloway had survived 12 combat deployments. He was not sure, for a long time after that Tuesday, that he had survived the hospital corridor. But he had. Partly because of Sophie. Mostly because of Sophie. Entirely because of Sophie. She was 7 now. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubbornness, and a laugh that could fill a room the way sunlight fills a room. Suddenly, completely, like it had always been there, and you'd simply forgotten to notice. She was currently asleep in her grandmother's house on the east side of Kalispell, because Ethan's night shifts ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., and the school day started at 8, and the math of single parenthood rarely worked out clean. He was 40 minutes from home when he saw the SUV go. Highway 2 eastbound, 5:23 in the morning. The storm had been building since midnight. Ethan had watched it through the factory's high clerestory windows, the sky going from black to a particular shade of purple-white that meant serious accumulation. By the time his shift ended and he stepped into the parking lot, the wind had teeth. His Ford F-250 was running before he'd finished buttoning his coat. He'd left it idling the last hour of his shift, a habit he'd developed in his second Montana winter after the first one had cost him a battery and an hour of standing in -12 while waiting for APOA. The highway was bad. Not closed bad, not yet, but the kind of bad where you drove 40 in a 55 and you kept both hands on the wheel and you left more space than you thought you needed between yourself and the taillights in front of you. There weren't many taillights, this stretch of 2, this time of morning, in this weather. Most people with any sense were home and horizontal. He almost missed it. The SUV was a black Range Rover, late model, the kind that cost more than Ethan made in a year. He'd noticed it a mile back because it was moving too fast for conditions. Not reckless exactly, but with the overconfidence of someone who trusted the vehicle more than the road. He'd watched it in his mirrors with the quiet professional attention of a man who'd spent years assessing threats and calculating outcomes. When it hit the ice patch, it went sideways fast. The driver corrected. He could see that, could see the brief countersteer, but overcorrected. And then the Range Rover was spinning across both lanes with a horrible balletic grace, the headlights sweeping wide arcs across the blowing snow. And then it was off the shoulder and into the dark and gone. Ethan was already braking. The pickup ahead of him didn't slow. A second set of taillights in his rearview mirror, a third, they all kept moving. Which wasn't cowardice exactly. It was cold and dark and early, and this stretch of highway had no shoulder to speak of, and a ditch that dropped 8 feet to a frozen creek bed. And the rational calculation for most people was that someone else would stop or the driver would be fine, or the highway patrol was already on it. Ethan Calloway had stopped making rational calculations in situations like this somewhere around his third deployment. He pulled the F-250 hard onto the shoulder, hit the hazard lights, and was out of the cab before he'd consciously decided to be. The wind hit him like a wall. Visibility was maybe 30 yards. He had a mag light in the truck, one of the long aluminum ones he'd carried since the Navy, and he grabbed it and clicked it on and went over the lip of the shoulder into the dark. The Range Rover had carved a trench through the snowbank before stopping against a stand of lodgepole pines maybe 40 feet down the embankment. One of the headlights was still burning. The other was dark. The front corner of the vehicle compressed in a way that didn't look good. He went down fast, using the trees for handholds, snow to his thighs in the drifts. The driver's side door was buckled. He could see the airbag had deployed through the cracked window, and through the airbag he could see a shape. Someone slumped against the door, face turned away from him. He couldn't tell if they were conscious. He put his fist through the window, reached in, tried the interior handle. The door didn't move. He tried again. It moved maybe 2 inches and stopped. The frame was bent, the door pinched in its own body. Come on. He braced one boot against the door frame, got both hands on the door edge above the latch, and pulled with his legs and his back and everything he had left after 8 hours of industrial maintenance. Something gave, not the door exactly, but the seal around it, the twisted metal surrendering a half-inch at a time. And then it opened with a sound like a gunshot and cold air rushed in, and the person inside made a sound. She was alive. That was the first thing. The second thing was that she was a woman, maybe late 20s or early 30s, dark hair matted against her face from the airbag's powder, a cut above her left eyebrow that had bled down her cheek and frozen there in the cold. She was wearing a coat that was too thin for the conditions, cashmere maybe, or something like it, the kind of coat designed for airport terminals and hotel lobbies rather than Montana winters. She had one hand pressed against the steering wheel and the other bent at her wrist in a way that made Ethan's stomach drop. "Hey," he said. "Can you hear me?" She turned her head toward him. Her eyes were unfocused at first, then sharpened, brown eyes, something behind them that was fighting to stay present. "Can you move?" She tried to shift and gasped. "My wrist. I think my wrist." "Don't move it. Can you feel your feet?" A pause. She was testing herself. He respected that. "Yes." "Neck? Any pain in your neck or back?" "No, I don't think so." I was already doing the assessment in his head, the trauma protocol that lived so deep in his muscle memory, he could run it half asleep. Airway clear, breathing present, circulation. The wrist was concerning. The head cut had stopped bleeding or close to it. She was conscious and responsive and moving air without difficulty. The wrist was probably broken or badly sprained. The head cut needed cleaning. The rest of it he couldn't know without equipment he didn't have. What he knew was that the car was not going to start. The front end was destroyed. And the temperature was 14 degrees and falling, and the storm showed no signs of stopping, and they were 40 feet off the highway in the dark. "I'm going to get you out," he said. "I need you to trust me and do what I say. My name is Ethan." She looked at him for a moment with those focused, unfocused eyes. "Natalie," she said. "Okay, Natalie, here's what's going to happen." He'd thought about this road before, in the abstract way you think about roads you travel twice a day. There was an old access road 300 yards east, used by the county for equipment storage, and at the end of that access road there was a hunting cabin that the county maintenance crew used as a warming station. He knew this because he'd once helped a county worker get unstuck from the ditch beside that access road, and the man had pointed it out, offered the use of it if Ethan ever needed shelter. He'd probably never thought about that conversation again. He was thinking about it now. He got Natalie out of the Range Rover carefully, keeping her right hand, the damaged one, against her body, one arm around her back. She was taller than he'd expected, and she had the particular kind of stubbornness that came with physical pain. She wanted to walk, was determined to walk, and he let her try for about 15 feet before the snow swallowed her to the knee and she stumbled and he caught her. "Different plan," he said. She started to argue. He picked her up. She went silent. The walk to the access road was the worst part. The wind was coming from the northwest, directly into his face, and carrying it the kind of dry snow that found every gap in your clothing and your courage. He had his mag light tucked in his coat pocket, clicking it on every 30 seconds to check his heading, and Natalie was quiet against his chest, quiet in a way that worried him slightly, the way a person goes quiet when they're conserving everything for the basic work of staying conscious. "Talk to me," he said. "Tell me anything." "About what?" "Doesn't matter, just keep talking." A pause. The wind, the snow. "I'm from Chicago," she said. "I hate being cold." "That's relevant. I didn't pack for this." "I noticed. My assistant said it would be 32 degrees. Your assistant's never been to Montana in January." She made a sound that might have been a short laugh if it hadn't been so cold. "No, I suppose not." He found the access road by almost missing it. The sign was buried, but the depression in the snow was still visible, the tree line breaking on one side. He turned into it, and the wind dropped a little, the trees giving partial cover, and the walk became merely brutal rather than impossible. The cabin was where he remembered it. A squat structure, maybe 400 square feet, with a wood stove and a stack of split pine beside the door, and the kind of basic supply cache that county workers kept stocked against emergencies. Matches, a 2-month-old first aid kit, a wool blanket that smelled like storage, 2 cans of soup, a lantern with half a tank of fuel. He got the door open, got Natalie inside, got her down on the floor. There was a folding cot against the wall, which he unfolded with one hand and 1 foot in a sequence that was mostly luck. The wood stove took him 4 minutes to get going, which felt like 40. He used the lantern while the fire built, and in its light, he got his first real look at her. The cut above her eyebrow was shallow. Scalp wounds bled dramatically and meant less than they looked. The wrist was swelling significantly, the skin tight and discolored around the joint. He couldn't tell without imaging whether it was broken or sprained, but it needed to be immobilized either way. He found 2 pieces of flat kindling that would work as splints and wrapped them with gauze from the first aid kit, taping them into place with the athletic tape that every first aid kit seemed to include and nobody ever used. She watched him work with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You've done this before," she said. "Some." "Medical training?" "Among other things." She waited for him to continue. He didn't. The fire was going properly now, the cast iron beginning to tick and warm, and the cabin temperature was climbing toward tolerable. He handed her the wool blanket and she wrapped it around her shoulders without complaint, which told him the hypothermia risk was low. People who were seriously cold stopped feeling the cold as cold, started feeling it as nothing, and they didn't reach for blankets. She was cold, but she was present. He heated one of the cans of soup on the top of the stove, tomato, the kind in the red can, with a bent tab on the lid, and poured it into a tin cup he found on the shelf above the wood stove. "Drink this." She took it with her left hand, wrapping both hands around the cup, then caught herself and adjusted for the splint on her right. She drank. Some color came back into her face. Outside, the storm tore at the cabin walls. The chimney sang. The fire crackled and settled. "My phone's dead," she said. "The crash? Mine has signal about 1 bar out of 5. I already sent our location to emergency services." He'd done it the moment they were inside. A brief text with coordinates he'd pulled from a mapping app while the fire was building. "With conditions like this, they won't be able to reach us until the storm breaks, but they know where we are." She nodded slowly. I was sitting across from her on an overturned crate, still in his work coat, still running through the mental checklist. She was stable. She was warming. The wrist was as managed as it was going to be without a hospital. The cut had stopped bleeding and didn't need stitches. He'd cleaned it with antiseptic wipe and taped the edges closed, and it would scar minimally, if at all. What he noticed in the firelight was that she was watching him with an expression that had moved past grateful and into something more complicated. Assessing. The way a person looks at something they don't have a category for. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "What?" "On the highway. Everyone else kept going. Why did you stop?" He thought about that for a moment. Not the answer. He knew the answer, but whether to give it. "Habit," he said finally. She tilted her head. "That's not really an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not." The fire popped. A log shifted, sent a shower of sparks against the glass of the stove door. Outside, the wind made a sound like something enormous moving through the trees. "You work nights," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen his clothes, the work pants, the steel-toed boots, the kind of coat that showed what it had been through. Maintenance tech at Apex Meridian, out on Route 93. Something moved across her face, quick and controlled and almost invisible. If he hadn't spent years reading rooms under pressure, he would have missed it entirely. "You know it?" he asked. "I've heard of it," she said, which was true as far as it went. What she didn't say, what she had no reason to say, and several reasons not to, was that she had flown into Glacier Park International 2 days ago on a company jet, that she had spent the previous day in Kalispell reviewing financial projections with Victor Langford and Miles Corbett, that the entire reason she was on Highway 2 at 5 in the morning, in a snowstorm, was that she'd needed to drive out to the site before the workforce arrived, to see it before the people in it saw her, that she was the CEO of Apex Meridian Industries, that she had come to Montana to approve a restructuring plan, that the restructuring plan included a list, that the list had names on it. She wrapped both hands, one in its splint, one bare, around the tin cup of soup and looked at the fire and did not say any of these things. Ethan Calloway sat across from her on an overturned crate and did not ask. The storm pressed against the cabin from all sides. The fire held. The night was long and cold, and they were both, in their different ways, waiting for morning, though neither of them could have said, honestly, what they were expecting morning to bring. Natalie's wrist throbbed in its splint. Her head ached behind her eyes in a dull, persistent way that she suspected was more than the cold. Ethan kept the fire stoked every hour, waking from a light doze to add wood with the automated competence of someone whose body had learned to sleep at 2/3 power and stay ready at 1/3. He didn't sleep deeply. He never slept deeply. At some point before dawn, she said quietly, thinking he was asleep, "Thank you." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought she'd been right, that he'd been sleeping. Then, "Don't mention it." She didn't say anything else. He didn't either. Outside, the storm continued its argument with the Montana dark, and the fire in the old cast-iron stove threw its orange light across the two of them. A woman who had come to Montana to make decisions about people she'd never met, and the man she'd just met, whose name she already knew from a different kind of document entirely. She would think about that later. She would think about it a great deal. But that was later. Right now, there was only the fire, and the cold outside the fire, and the strange suspended peace of a night that had almost ended very differently. The highway crew reached the cabin at 8:30. 2 county trucks, a plow, and a paramedic unit that had been staged 3 miles east waiting for the storm to drop below whiteout conditions. Ethan heard them before he saw them, the particular low growl of diesel engines working hard against packed snow. And he'd already gotten the fire banked down and Natalie's coat back on her shoulders by the time the first knock came at the door. The paramedics wanted to take her to Kalispell Regional. She declined, which surprised them, and didn't surprise Ethan at all. She'd been making decisions since the moment she regained full consciousness, the kind of quiet, constant decision-making that people with authority did automatically, like breathing. She accepted a proper splint over the one Ethan had rigged, allowed them to clean the cut above her eyebrow, agreed to a concussion assessment that she passed without difficulty. "You need imaging on that wrist," the paramedic said. He was 20-something, earnest, with the careful tone of someone reciting protocol to a person who clearly wasn't going to follow it. "I'll arrange it," Natalie said. "Ma'am, I'd strongly recommend, I'll arrange it today. Thank you." The paramedic looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him with an expression that said, "I know, there's nothing to be done." The paramedic accepted this with the resignation of his profession and began repacking his kit. One of the county workers had already called a tow for the Range Rover, and a second vehicle, a black Chevrolet Suburban with Apex Meridian plates, which Ethan noticed and filed away without comment, had appeared on the access road. A man in a gray suit got out, moving through the snow with the unhappy urgency of someone whose job had just become significantly more complicated. He spoke to Natalie in a low voice for about 30 seconds. She listened without changing expression. Ethan stood a few feet away, doing nothing in particular, which was its own kind of watching. Before she got into the Suburban, Natalie turned back to him. She looked at him in the gray morning light, full light now, the storm retreating to a steady snowfall, the world white and quiet and enormous around them. And he could see her working through something. What to say? What it was appropriate to say? Whether anything was appropriate at all. I meant what I said last night, she told him. I know you did. Is there anything I can do for you or your family? We're fine, he said. Drive careful. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then she nodded once and got into the Suburban, and the door closed, and the vehicle turned around on the access road and disappeared through the trees. Ethan stood there for a moment in the cold. Then he got into his F-250 and drove home. He had 6 hours before his next shift. He spent most of them at his kitchen table, drinking bad coffee and watching Sophie eat cereal and explain, in exhaustive and enthusiastic detail, the modifications she was planning for her wind turbine's rotor blade geometry. He understood maybe 40% of what she said. He nodded at the right intervals and refilled her orange juice and thought she was the most extraordinary thing he'd ever seen. He did not tell her about the night before. She was 7. She didn't need to know about every version of the dark. He arrived at Apex Meridian at 9:50 that night, 20 minutes before his shift, which was his habit. The parking lot was different, more cars than usual, several with out-of-state plates. A pair of black SUVs parked near the main entrance that had not been there when he left that morning. Marcus Webb, who ran the instrument panel on the casting floor and had the kind of face that collected information without appearing to, was finishing a cigarette near the side entrance. "Corporate's here," Marcus said, by way of greeting. "I know," Ethan said, though he hadn't, technically. "Big delegation, flew in yesterday, apparently. Something about restructuring." Marcus took a long drag and exhaled slowly into the cold. Harold's in there looking like he swallowed something that's still moving. Harold Keene was the plant manager, a 63-year-old man who had spent 31 years at Apex Meridian and knew every bolt and bearing in the facility by name, more or less. He and Ethan had an understanding built on very few words and a great deal of mutual professional respect, the kind of relationship that exists between people who both take the same kind of work seriously in a world that mostly doesn't. "They say anything about layoffs?" Ethan asked. Marcus looked at him, not out loud, but Victor Langford's been walking the floor with a clipboard since 2 this afternoon, and you know what that means. Ethan knew what that meant. He went inside. The main conference room on the administrative level was glass-walled, which was either a design choice meant to project transparency or an accident of 90s architecture that nobody had bothered to correct. From the shop floor, you couldn't hear what was being said, but you could see the shape of the meeting, the way you can read a conversation from across a restaurant by watching faces and posture. Ethan was crossing the floor toward the equipment room when he looked up. The conference room was lit. Around the table, Victor Langford, Apex Meridian COO, a man built like a defensive tackle gone to seed, with close-cropped silver hair and the particular brand of confidence that came from being right about things just frequently enough to stop examining whether he was wrong. Beside him, Miles Corbett, the CFO, thin and precise, the human equivalent of a spreadsheet. Two people Ethan didn't recognize with laptops open in front of them. And at the head of the table, back to the glass, in a charcoal blazer, her right wrist in a proper fiberglass splint. Ethan stopped walking. He stood on the shop floor of the facility where he had worked for 4 years and looked up at the woman he had carried through a blizzard 8 hours ago, and she was already looking at him. The distance between them was maybe 60 feet of open air and 1 pane of industrial glass. She didn't look away. Neither did he. He wasn't sure how long that lasted. It felt like several seconds, and was probably 1. Then Victor Langford said something, and Natalie turned her head, and the moment dissolved, and Ethan started walking again, the same direction he'd been going, his face arranged into the expression it usually wore at work, attentive, neutral, revealing nothing. Behind him, he could feel Marcus Webb's eyes on his back. He didn't turn around. The inspection began at 10:30. Ethan knew because Harold Keene appeared in the equipment room with the expression Marcus had described, a man who had swallowed something and was not happy about its continued presence, and said, without preamble, "They're walking the floor. Corporate delegation. I need you to be available." "For what?" "Questions. Demonstration. Whatever they want." Harold hesitated. "Victor's driving this. The CEO is along for the walk." Ethan picked up his wrench. Understood. The delegation came through the floor like a weather system. Victor in front, setting the pace, narrating everything in the smooth, practiced tone of someone who had prepared his presentation thoroughly and intended everyone to know it. Corbett behind him with a tablet, pulling up figures when requested. The two people with laptops had become the two people with clipboards. They wrote things down constantly. Ethan had no idea what. Natalie walked slightly apart from the group. She was looking at things. Not the things Victor was pointing at. The upgraded robotic assembly units, the efficiency board on the south wall, the new overhead conveyor system. But other things. Smaller things. The crack running along the base of pressure housing 3 that Ethan had flagged 6 weeks ago. The way the overhead lighting flickered in a 3-second cycle above the older hydraulic press. The sensor panel on the coolant management system, whose bottom left display had been showing anomalous readings since Thanksgiving. He watched her notice these things, and he revised something in his assessment of her. Then the coolant system alarm went off. It was a modest alarm by factory standards, not the full emergency klaxon, just the secondary alert that indicated a circuit deviation. Most people on the floor had learned to treat it as background noise because it had been going off intermittently for 2 months, and management had classified it as a sensor calibration issue. Ethan did not treat it as background noise. He was already moving when Victor, mid-sentence about quarterly efficiency gains, registered that something had happened. The coolant management system for the east casting array was behind a panel on the north wall. Ethan had the panel open in under a minute. What he found was not a sensor calibration issue. It was a partially occluded return line, the blockage sitting at a junction where the system's diagnostic sensors happened to have a blind spot. The digital readout said pressure was nominal. The actual pressure in the line was building toward a threshold that would compromise the heat exchangers for the entire east array. He had it cleared and the system restabilized in 11 minutes. When he turned around, Natalie was standing 6 feet behind him, slightly apart from the rest of the group. Victor was checking his phone with the impatience of a man whose presentation had been interrupted. Corbett was recalculating something. The clipboard people were writing. "How did you know?" Natalie said. Her voice was different here than it had been in the cabin. Controlled, measured, the voice of someone who spent their days in rooms where everything said was being evaluated. But the question was genuine. "The sound," Ethan said. "Blocked return line has a different pitch than a sensor error. Higher frequency, intermittent, and if you hadn't caught it? Heat exchangers would have gone within the hour. East array down for probably 3 days, plus the repair cost." Victor had put his phone away. "The sensor diagnostic didn't flag anything," he said, with a tone that suggested this was Ethan's problem rather than the sensors. "The sensor doesn't cover that junction," Ethan said. "It never has. I mentioned it in my maintenance report in October. And November." A brief silence. Victor's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Natalie looked at Victor, then back at Ethan. "Do you have copies of those reports?" "Harold has them." "I'd like to see them," Victor said smoothly. "I'm sure we can pull those up during the documentation review tomorrow, Natalie. Right now I want to make sure we stay on schedule." "Of course," she said, just as smoothly. "Please continue." The inspection moved on. Ethan went back to his rounds, but he was aware, in the peripheral way that had kept him alive in places far more dangerous than this, that Natalie Harrington was paying attention to things that Victor Langford would have preferred she not notice, and that Victor knew it and was managing it, and was very good at managing it. The thing about people who were very good at managing things was that they often forgot someone might be watching them manage. I was checking torque settings on the press assembly at the west end of the floor when his phone buzzed. He had his ringer off during shift. Floor noise made it useless anyway, but he checked the screen out of habit. It was Sophie's teacher, Karen Howell. He read the message twice. Then he stepped into the relative quiet of the equipment corridor and called back. "Mr. Calloway." Karen Howell was one of those teachers who always sounded like she was smiling, even when delivering serious news. "I'm sorry to bother you at work. Sophie asked me to call." "Is she okay?" "She's wonderful. She wanted you to know immediately. The science fair results came in tonight. The committee made an exception and sent preliminary results by email because Sophie made them promise." Something in his chest did something complicated. "And?" "She won first place, Mr. Calloway. Regional division, middle and elementary combined. The wind turbine project. They said the judges had never seen a primary school student work with efficiency coefficients before. They'd like her to present at the state competition in March." He stood in the equipment corridor of Apex Meridian Industries, a wrench in one hand and his phone in the other. and felt something move through him that he didn't have a ready category for. Not quite pride, though it was that something bigger than pride, something that lived below pride, in the place where a father kept the things that made all the rest of it worth doing. "Can I talk to her?" he said. "She's right here. She's been waiting by the phone for 20 minutes. A shuffling sound, and then Sophie's voice. "Dad, Dad, I won. Did Mrs. Howell tell you? I won. She told me. The judges said my bets limit calculations were accurate. I looked it up after and they were right. I did get them right. Dad, I got them right." "I know. Are you proud?" He leaned his back against the equipment room wall and closed his eyes for 2 seconds. "Sophie," he said, "I've been proud of you since the day you were born, but right now I'm a specific kind of proud that I don't have a word for yet." She laughed. That laugh, the one that filled rooms like sunlight, came through the phone and filled the equipment corridor. "I'm going to make the blades better for the state competition," she told him. "I figured out the pitch angle is off by about 4 degrees. Mrs. Howell says I can use the workshop on Saturdays." "Whatever you need," he said. "Okay, go back to work, Dad. I know you're at work. I love you, kid." "Love you too. Bye." The line went quiet. He stood there for another moment, the phone in his hand, the noise of the factory filtering through the corridor wall. Then he heard something he shouldn't have, and the private warmth of the moment went cold very fast. He hadn't heard anyone approach. He'd been focused on the call, which meant his awareness had narrowed, something he usually didn't permit himself, something he'd trained out of himself a long time ago. But focus did that. Love did that. He turned. Natalie Harrington was standing at the corridor entrance, a clipboard tucked under her left arm, her expression doing something he couldn't quite name. She'd clearly heard at least part of the call, enough by her face to know what it was about. "Sorry," she said. "I wasn't trying to—" "It's all right." "Your daughter?" "She won her school science fair." He said it simply, the same way he'd tell anyone, but there was no way to make it simple, entirely. It was in his voice before he could manage it out. Natalie looked at him for a moment. Not the way she'd been looking at everything on the floor, assessing, cataloging, building a picture. Something different, something more direct. "What was the project?" "Wind turbine. She built it from scrap parts mostly. Stuff I brought home from work." He paused. "She's 7. 7, Natalie repeated. "Going on 35. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, the near miss of one. Then, from down the corridor, Victor Langford's voice, carrying the particular tone of a man who had been looking for someone. "Natalie, if you have a moment, Miles has the projected figures ready." The near smile didn't complete itself. Natalie straightened slightly, shifted the clipboard. "Congratulations to her," she said to Ethan quietly. Then she walked back toward the conference room, and Ethan went back to his rounds, and neither of them said anything more. But something had changed. He couldn't have said precisely what. He'd worked in environments where reading small shifts was survival, and he knew, with the certainty of someone who'd learned to trust that particular instinct at considerable personal cost, that something had shifted in the way Natalie Harrington was thinking about this plant, this inspection, and possibly this night. He didn't examine it beyond that. He had work to do. So, Victor Langford presented his restructuring proposal at 11 o'clock in the conference room with the doors closed. Ethan was not in the room. Harold Keene was, however, and Harold had the useful quality of not needing to write things down to remember them. Harold found Ethan in the generator room at midnight. "They want to cut 32 positions," Harold said, without opening ceremony. "Night shift maintenance is the primary target. Victor's argument is that the new automated monitoring systems can handle diagnostic functions, so experienced techs are redundant." "The automated monitoring systems couldn't find a blocked return line tonight," Ethan said. "I know that." "Victor knows that too." "I know that also." Harold sat down heavily on a supply crate. He was the kind of man who looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "He's got the CFO's numbers behind him. Cost analysis showing that automation plus 1 or 2 junior techs runs 60% cheaper than the current night maintenance team. He's framed it as technological progress." "What's Natalie? What's the CEO's position?" Harold looked at him. "She's been quiet. That's what worries me. Victor runs these meetings, and she listens and asks questions and you can't tell which direction she's leaning. He paused. She asked for the maintenance reports tonight, after the floor walk. I heard. Victor said he'd have them pulled together for tomorrow's review. Will he? Harold's expression answered that before his mouth did. He'll have a version of them. Whether it resembles what was actually filed is a different conversation. He stood up, knees cracking, and rubbed the back of his neck. You're on the list, Ethan. I want you to know that. I've seen the preliminary document. You're one of the first names. Ethan received this information the way he received most difficult information, without visible reaction, storing it somewhere for later processing when the immediate situation allowed. Okay, he said. Okay? Harold looked at him with something between frustration and resigned admiration. That's all you've got? What do you want me to say, Harold? I don't know. Something. This is your job. You've been here 4 years. You do the work of 2 people on a good night and 3 on a bad one, and some guy with a spreadsheet who's never set foot on a plant floor before tonight wants to replace you with a software package. Software packages don't hear return line blockages. No, they don't. Harold straightened, adjusted his glasses. I'm going to fight it. I want you to know that. I know. I don't know if I'll win. I know that too. Harold left. Ethan sat in the generator room for a moment, the machines around him doing their work, the whole vast and different mechanical world of the plant, humming at frequencies that he'd learned so thoroughly they'd become a kind of silence. He thought about Sophie, about Bet's limit calculations and pitch angle errors, and a 7-year-old who'd built a wind turbine out of discarded machine parts because her father brought interesting pieces home and she'd figured out what to do with them. I thought about the woman at the head of the conference room table, the woman he'd splinted and carried and kept warm through a Montana blizzard, who was now reviewing documents that would determine whether he still had a job at the end of the week. He thought about the particular unfairness of the world, which was not a new thought, and which he didn't spend long on, because unfairness had never been something he had patience for dwelling in. You worked with what was in front of you. You assessed the situation accurately and without illusion. You made the best decision available, and you lived with the outcome. That was the theory. The practice was harder, on nights when the outcome included Sophie's college fund and the mortgage on a house that still had some of her mother's things in the closet that he hadn't been able to deal with yet. He got up. He went back to work. At 2:40 in the morning, in the deep quiet part of the night shift when the factory settled into its rhythms and the administrative offices upstairs had been dark for hours, Ethan was doing his second check of the casting sector. He stopped. The casting sector was the oldest part of the facility, built out in the late 80s, expanded twice, running on infrastructure that had been upgraded in pieces rather than wholesale, the way old things get maintained when there's never enough money to replace them properly. The pressure management system in this sector was a hybrid, digital sensors feeding the main monitoring board, but also a set of original analog gauges mounted on the wall near the valve housings, left in place more out of inertia than intention. Most of the night crew didn't look at the analog gauges. They watched the digital board. Ethan looked at both. He looked at them now. The digital board showed nominal pressure across all lines, green lights, standard readings, nothing to flag. The analog gauge on line 3 showed something different. The needle had moved, not into red, not yet, but it was climbing in a way that didn't match the digital reading, in a way that suggested the digital sensor was not seeing what the analog gauge was seeing. He put his hand on the pipe housing near valve 3, felt the vibration. Standard vibration, standard frequency. And then, below it, at a frequency you couldn't feel with your palm but could feel with your fingertips. If you'd spent enough years doing this, something else. A harmonic, the kind that built. He stood very still. The factory was loud, always loud, the baseline noise of heavy industrial operation. But Ethan Calloway had been in loud places all his life. In loud places, he'd learned to hear the things inside the noise, the signals that ordinary hearing discarded as irrelevant. He heard something. It was faint. It was high. It was the sound of metal under stress finding a voice. He knew that sound. He had learned it the hard way, a long time ago, in a context very different from this one. But stress was stress, and metal under pressure had the same voice everywhere. His expression changed. His hand came off the pipe. his body oriented toward the emergency systems panel on the south wall. His mind was already doing the math: valve age, pressure differential, rate of climb, time to critical threshold. They had seconds, maybe less. The former SEAL inside Ethan Calloway did not deliberate. He moved. He hit the emergency shutdown at 2:47 in the morning. The button was red and large and covered by a hinged plastic guard that existed specifically to prevent accidental activation. You had to flip the guard up first, then press. A two-step sequence that added maybe 1 second to the process. Ethan had the guard up before he'd consciously registered moving his hand. He pressed. The effect was not subtle. The casting sector's main drive systems cut power in a staggered sequence. Not instantaneous, because instantaneous shutdown on 40-year-old industrial equipment could cause mechanical damage worse than a controlled stop, so the system engineers had built in a 4-second cascade. The big press slowed. The conveyor belts decelerated. The overhead systems wound down through their frequencies with a sound like the world losing its voice one register at a time. And then the alarms. Not the modest secondary alert of a coolant deviation. The full emergency klaxon, which lived at a decibel level that bypassed thinking and went directly to the older parts of the nervous system. The parts that knew, without being told, that something serious had occurred. For 2 seconds, nobody moved. The night crew on the casting floor, 7 men and 2 women, people Ethan had worked beside for years, stood in the sudden relative quiet of a powered-down facility and stared at the red alarm lights cycling across the ceiling. Then Tommy Reyes, 24 years old and the newest member of the night maintenance team, looked at Ethan and said, "What did you—" "Everyone out," Ethan said. "East emergency exit. Now. Don't run. Walk fast. Stay together." The board shows normal. "Tommy." Ethan's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. It had a quality that certain voices develop under certain conditions. A flatness that was not calmness, but was something more functional than calmness. Something that communicated absolute certainty without requiring volume. "East exit. Right now." Tommy went. They all went. Ethan stayed. He went back to the valve housing because he needed to know how much time he had, and the only way to know was to look. The analog gauge needle had climbed further. It was in the yellow zone now, the band between nominal and critical, and it was still moving. The digital sensor beside it continued to report normal pressure with the serene confidence of a system that had no idea it was wrong. He could hear it clearly now. That high metallic whistle that had been a barely there harmonic 10 minutes ago had become something real, something present, a sound that the valve housing was making because the metal was stressed and the seal was compromised, and the 40-year-old pressure rating on that valve was becoming a theoretical rather than actual number. He estimated 45 seconds. Maybe a minute. He was already moving toward the control room on the sector's north side when Victor Langford appeared at the top of the iron stairs that connected the administrative mezzanine to the shop floor. He was in his shirt sleeves, his collar open, the look of a man who'd been in a late working session and had registered the alarm from 3 floors up. "What the hell is going on?" Victor's voice carried over the klaxon. "Who hit the shutdown?" "I did," Ethan said, still moving. "Valve 3 on the casting pressure line. Digital sensors not reading the actual pressure. Analog gauge shows critical range." Victor came down the stairs fast, landed on the floor, and looked at the digital board on the south wall. All green lights, nominal readings across every line. "The board shows normal," Victor said. "The board is wrong." "Calloway, do you understand what a full shutdown of the casting sector costs this company per hour? We are at—" "Victor." Ethan stopped. He turned and looked at the COO of Apex Meridian Industries with the direct, unqualified attention of a man explaining something for the last time. "Get off the floor." "I am not going to—" "The valve is going to blow. I don't know if it's going to be a clean rupture or if the line pressure is going to take the seal housing with it. If it takes the housing, we're looking at a fire event in an enclosed casting sector. Your people are already clear. You are not clear. Get off the floor." Victor stared at him. Behind Victor, on the mezzanine, Ethan saw Natalie Harrington appear at the top of the stairs. She'd come from the same direction as Victor, the administrative wing, still in her blazer, the splinted wrist at her side. She took in the scene below, the powered-down machinery, the cycling alarm lights, Victor on the floor, Ethan. She looked at Ethan. He didn't have time to parse whatever was in that look. He turned back to the control room. Calloway. Victor's voice, harder now, the confidence of institutional authority reasserting itself. I'm ordering you to stand down. I'm ordering you to restore production. Every minute of downtime on this line is money we cannot recover, and you don't have the authority to make this call unilaterally. Ethan reached the control room. Through the glass panel, he could see the pressure management console, the full readout, all gauges, the master system view. On the master system view, in the analog pressure column for line 3, the number was not in the yellow anymore. I don't need authority, Ethan said. I need you off my floor. He went into the control room. Victor came in behind him. Calloway, I swear to you, if you don't restore this line in the next 60 seconds, your termination papers will be on the CEO's desk before morning. They probably already are, Ethan said. He was looking at the master console. He was also watching the clock on the wall, the second hand sweeping, and he was counting down in his head with the internal precision that combat had built into him. That absolute automatic measurement of time in high-pressure situations that became as natural as breathing. 30 seconds. Maybe. Victor. It was Natalie's voice from the doorway of the control room. She'd come down the stairs and crossed the floor faster than Victor had registered. Step back. Victor turned. Natalie, this man has shut down a production line worth... I heard you the first time. She wasn't looking at Victor. She was looking at Ethan, at the console in front of him, at the analog gauge reading on the master system screen. Ethan, what do you need? He would think about that later. The fact that she'd used his name. The fact that she'd asked what he needed rather than what was happening or whether this was necessary. The fact that she'd assessed the situation fast enough to know the right question. For everyone to be off this floor, he said. Then we're leaving, she said. To Victor, directly, with no room in her tone for interpretation, now. Victor looked at her. Something in his face did a complicated calculation. Then he walked out. Natalie paused in the control room doorway, her hand on the frame. Are you going to be safe in here? She asked. It was such a strange question, such a human question, in the middle of everything. Go, he said. She went. Ethan stood at the master console and watched the analog pressure reading on line 3 and counted the seconds in his head, and the sound outside the control room's glass panel was the sound of an empty factory floor. No machinery, no voices, just the alarm and the cycling lights, and the particular quality of industrial silence that felt wrong because it was never supposed to be there. The valve blew at the 18-second mark. He'd expected it. He'd positioned himself behind the console's main housing, the heaviest piece of equipment in the room, for exactly this reason. The sound was immense. A crack that was partly mechanical failure and partly the compressed air in the line finding its release. A detonation that traveled through the floor and the walls and the soles of his boots and up through his skeleton. Then fire. Not a wall of it, not the catastrophic scenario. The seal housing had held, which meant the rupture was at the valve itself rather than the whole line, which was the better of the two bad outcomes. But the casting sector had combustible materials, lubricant residue, hydraulic fluid mist that accumulated in industrial environments the way dust accumulated in houses. And when a pressurized line vented heat at those temperatures, it found what it could find. The fire started fast and built faster. Through the control room's glass panel, he could see the casting sector, the big press to his left, the conveyor system beyond it, and to the right, the observation corridor. The observation corridor ran along the east wall of the casting sector, a glass and steel walkway, about 40 feet long and 8 feet wide, elevated a few feet above the floor, used for supervisory observation of the casting process. It connected the administrative mezzanine at one end to an emergency exit at the other. The emergency exit at the far end had a jammed release mechanism. He knew this because he'd flagged it in his October maintenance report. The same report Victor had received, the same report that, as far as Ethan could tell, had gone nowhere. And Natalie Harrington was in the observation corridor. He saw her through the smoke that was beginning to fill the casting sector. She'd started for the mezzanine end, toward the stairs, but the fire had spread to the base of the stairwell faster than it should have, the lubricant residue on the floor catching and running, and she'd turned back toward the emergency exit. And now she was at the emergency exit, and it wasn't opening, and she was hitting the release bar with her good hand, and it wasn't moving. Ethan left the control room. The heat hit him like a physical weight, not yet at the level where skin blistered, but climbing toward it, the air carrying the particular quality of industrial fire, hotter at the source than in the surrounding space, moving in ways that ordinary fire didn't because the ventilation systems were pulling it. He had his coat over his face, not because it helped much, but because it helped something. He had maybe 90 seconds before the smoke in the casting sector reached the density where the options narrowed to nothing. He knew the floor. That was the thing. He'd walked this floor 1,000 times in 4 years, in daylight and darkness and every intermediate state. And he knew it the way you know your house at 3 in the morning without turning on the lights. He knew where the press extended its housing into the walkway. He knew where the floor was clear and where the equipment created obstacles. He didn't need to see clearly to move. He needed to move, and he did. He got to the base of the observation corridor in 30 seconds. The access door was a steel fire door that opened outward. He hit it hard with his shoulder, and it gave. And he was in the corridor, and Natalie was at the far end with her back against the jammed emergency exit, one arm over her face against the smoke. "Calloway?" Her voice was controlled. Barely, but controlled. "Yeah," he said. He crossed the corridor. There was an emergency supply cabinet on the wall, one of the stations that existed in every industrial facility and that nobody thought about until they needed to. He had it open before he'd consciously remembered it was there. Emergency fire blanket, sealed in its packet. He broke the packet, shook the blanket open, and got it over both of them. Over Natalie's shoulders, over his head, creating the reflective barrier that would buy them the minutes they needed. "The exit won't, I know." He'd already looked at the mechanism. It was a hardware failure. The release bar's connection to the latch corroded at the pivot point. Something that would have been a 30-minute fix with the right tools 6 months ago and was now a problem he didn't have the tools or the time to solve properly. He hit the bar. It moved slightly. He hit it again, harder, driving his heel into the base of it, which was not the recommended technique, but was what he had. On the third hit, something gave. Not the mechanism, the door frame. The frame had shifted slightly in the building's foundation, settling over 40 years. And the door had been binding against the frame as much as it had been binding against its own failed mechanism. And when the frame absorbed the impact, it flexed enough to clear the contact point, and the mechanism, compromised as it was, found just barely enough purchase to trip. The door swung open. Montana winter air hit them both. Minus something, with wind, the most beautiful cold Ethan had felt in his life. They went through the door and down the external emergency stairs, the fire blanket still over their shoulders, the alarm still audible through the walls of the building. Behind them, through the steel fire door that swung closed on its pneumatic arm, there was a secondary pressure burst. He felt it through the stairs, a vibration in the metal structure. The fire blanket would not have been enough for that. They stood on the snow-covered ground outside the east wall of the casting sector, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Natalie pulled the fire blanket off her head and looked at him. Her face was pale. Not the pale of cold. She'd been cold before. She knew what that felt like now. This was the pale of adrenaline receding, of a body recalculating what it had just been through. Her hair was disheveled. There was a smudge of soot along her jaw. The fiberglass splint on her right wrist had a scorch mark on it that hadn't been there before. She looked at him for a long moment. "Second time," she said. "Let's not make it a habit," he said. She made a sound. It was close enough to a laugh. They stood there in the cold while inside the building, the fire suppression systems that the plant had installed in 2019, the one capital improvement that Victor's cost-cutting hadn't managed to eliminate, began their work. The Kalispell Fire Department arrived 11 minutes later. By then, the fire suppression had contained the fire to the casting sector and the primary structural damage was done. The valve housing, the adjacent conveyor section, the floor area around the rupture point. The observation corridor had smoke damage. The control room windows had cracked from the heat. No one was hurt. All 9 members of the night crew were accounted for and uninjured. Ethan had known where they were because he'd counted them going out. Victor Langford had apparently not left the building. He'd retreated to the administrative mezzanine and was watching the proceedings from the upper level with the expression of a man doing rapid and uncomfortable mental arithmetic. Corbett was beside him on his phone, talking to someone with the clipped urgent sentences of a lawyer or an insurance representative. The fire department incident commander, a broad woman named Captain Reyes, who had no relation to Tommy Reyes and who had been running fire investigations in the Flathead Valley for 16 years, walked the damaged area with Harold Keene and then came to find Ethan. "You hit the shutdown," she said. "Yes." "When did you notice the pressure anomaly?" "The analog gauge was showing deviation about 10 minutes before I hit the button. I heard a harmonic in the valve housing that told me the digital sensor wasn't reading accurately." She wrote something down. "The digital sensor showed normal up to and past the rupture?" "As far as I know." She nodded slowly. "The independent report's going to take a few days. But for what it's worth, off the record, right now, if that line had been running at full production load when that valve went, we're talking about a much longer conversation, maybe a different kind of conversation." "I know," he said. "Good call," she said, and walked away. Victor found him 5 minutes later. He'd been expecting it. Victor Langford was a man who processed setbacks by converting them into someone else's problem, and the conversion process was usually fast. "You shut down a running line without authorization," Victor said. He'd gotten himself organized in the minutes since the fire department arrived. His shirt tucked in, his collar buttoned, the authority reinstated. "In doing so, you cost this company approximately 6 figures in production time, equipment damage, and emergency response. You created a panic among the workforce. You acted outside your sanctioned role." Ethan said nothing. "The sensor showed normal pressure. Your judgment, based on, what, a noise? A gut feeling? Overrode a validated monitoring system. I want you to understand the legal exposure that creates for this company." Victor. Harold Keene had materialized from somewhere, a presence that expanded when he chose to let it. "The valve ruptured. We all saw it. The man's judgment was correct. The valve might have been repaired. There were options short of a full emergency shutdown." "There were no other options," Ethan said flatly. "The pressure was at critical range. The digital sensor was not reading accurately. A 30-second delay on that shutdown, and we'd be having this conversation around hospital beds." "That's your version," Victor said. "It's the version with the burned-out valve housing and 12 people who went home tonight instead of to Kalispell Regional." Victor's jaw tightened. "Your termination paperwork is going to reflect an unauthorized shutdown, reckless disregard for company property, and gross insubordination. I want you to understand that." "Okay," Ethan said. The word landed the way he meant it to. Not as capitulation, but as a door closing. He wasn't going to argue the point. He wasn't going to perform distress for Victor's benefit. Whatever was going to happen would happen, and he'd deal with it. Victor looked at him with something that might have been surprise, or might have been the frustrated recognition that this particular lever wasn't working. Then he turned and walked back toward the administrative entrance. Harold stood beside Ethan in the cold, watching him go. "He's going to make it stick," Harold said quietly. "You know that. He's got the authority, and he knows how to use it, and he's scared, and scared men with authority are the most dangerous kind." "I know. He'll have the termination papers on her desk by morning. Frame it as you creating a crisis." "He might be right that I created a crisis," Ethan said. From where he was standing, with the information he had, that's a reasonable interpretation. Harold looked at him. "You don't believe that?" "What I believe doesn't change what the paperwork says." They stood there in the cold. The fire department was packing up. The casting sector's exterior ventilation was cycling, pushing the last of the smoke out through the roof vents. 3 of the night crew, Tommy Reyes among them, were standing in a cluster near the parking lot, too wired to go home, talking in low voices. Marcus Webb materialized at Ethan's elbow with 2 cups of coffee from the break room thermos. He handed one to Ethan without a word. Ethan took it. "For what it's worth," Marcus said, "every person on this floor knows what you did tonight." "It's worth something," Ethan said. "Just not enough, probably." "Probably not." The termination papers arrived on Natalie's desk at 6:15 in the morning, delivered by Corbett personally, with a cover memo from Victor that Ethan would later hear described as a masterwork of reframing. It characterized the emergency shutdown as a panic response by an employee with a documented history of unilateral action, exaggerating a manageable sensor calibration issue into a full production halt that cost the company $94,000 in direct losses. It characterized Ethan as a liability. It recommended immediate termination. Natalie read it at 6:22, according to the timestamp on her email read receipt. At 6:45, she met with Victor and Corbett in the conference room. Ethan was not present. Harold was not present. The meeting lasted 22 minutes. At 7:08, her assistant, a young man named Derek, who had been with her for 3 years and had learned to read her moods the way sailors read weather, called Harold Keene and told him that the CEO was requesting a full documentation review before any employment decisions were finalized, and that the review would require 48 hours. Victor, through Derek, conveyed that a 48-hour delay was operationally impractical given the circumstances. Natalie, through Derek, conveyed that she hadn't asked for Victor's opinion. Harold called Ethan at 7:15. Ethan was at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a bowl of cereal that Sophie had poured for herself and abandoned half-finished when the school bus arrived. He was staring at nothing in particular. He'd been doing that for a while. 48-hour review, Harold said. She's not signing anything until the investigation's complete. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Okay. That's buying time, Ethan. It's not a decision. I know. If Victor gets to control what goes into that review. Harold, Ethan said. He looked at the abandoned cereal bowl. The milk was going warm. I need to tell you something. What? I'm resigning. The line went quiet. Ethan, I've been thinking about it since last night, since Victor made his speech about unauthorized shutdowns. He picked up the cereal bowl and carried it to the sink. I'm not going to be the thing they fight over. I'm not going to be the instrument Victor uses to discredit the investigation or the instrument Natalie uses to go after Victor. Whatever's happening between them at that company level, that's not my fight. You saved 12 lives last night, Harold said. You've got a right to. I saved 12 lives because I know how to do my job. That's all it is. That's not a bargaining chip. He ran the bowl under water, watching the milk swirl and drain. I'll be in at 9 to file the paperwork. I'd like to clean out my locker. Ethan. Harold's voice had gone rough in the way of a man who didn't often let his voice do that. Think about Sophie. I am thinking about Sophie, Ethan said. I've been thinking about Sophie since 2:47 this morning. I think she deserves a father who walks away from things he can't fix with his own hands and his own conscience. Not a father who stays in a fight because walking away looks like losing. Harold was quiet for a long time. I'll have the paperwork ready, he said finally. Thank you. For what it's worth, ma'am. And I know you don't put stock in this kind of thing, but for what it's worth, you're the best maintenance technician I've worked with in 31 years. And I've worked with a lot of them. Ethan stood at the sink with the water running and didn't say anything for a moment. That means something, Harold, he said. That means more than you know. He hung up. He stood at the sink. Outside the kitchen window, the Montana morning was doing what Montana mornings did in January, arriving gray and cold and enormous, the mountains visible through the bare cottonwoods at the back of his property, the sky the color of old ice. Beautiful in its way, brutal in its way. The same thing, up here. He thought about the woman at the head of the table. He thought about 48 hours and what it would cost her to spend them fighting something that might not be fixable from inside the machine. He thought about the termination papers and what it meant that she hadn't signed them, and what it would mean for her if she didn't. He thought about a lot of things. Then he got up, rinsed his own coffee cup, set it in the rack to dry, and went to get his coat. He drove to Apex Meridian for the last time under a gray Montana sky. The mountains on his left, the frozen fields on his right, the road ahead of him long and straight and empty in the way that Montana roads were. A kind of space that could feel like freedom or loneliness, depending on who was looking at it and where they were going. He filed his resignation at 9:14 in the morning. He cleaned out his locker in 12 minutes. He'd never kept much there. A change of work clothes, a spare pair of gloves, a photograph of Sophie that he'd taped to the inside of the door 4 years ago, and that he took down now and folded carefully and put in his shirt pocket. He said goodbye to Marcus, who shook his hand and didn't say much, which was exactly right. He nodded to Tommy Reyes, who looked young and confused and like he was trying to figure out what had just happened to his understanding of how the world worked. He walked out through the main facility entrance, past the security desk, past the parking lot where his shift had started and ended more times than he could count, past the flagpole that had a Montana state flag that always needed tightening on its lanyard and that he'd tightened 100 times without being asked. He got into his truck. He sat there for a moment. Through the windshield, he could see the plant, The building he knew better than almost any place he'd been since leaving the Navy. The pipes and valves and systems and machinery he understood down to their failure signatures. The people inside it, whose shift schedules and personal dramas and skill levels and weaknesses he'd cataloged over 4 years with the quiet professional attention of someone who knew that in industrial environments, the person beside you was always, at some level, someone you were responsible for. He started the engine. He drove home. He didn't look back, which was not indifference. It was the particular discipline of a man who knew that looking back at things he'd decided to leave was a kind of self-inflicted wound, and he'd had enough of those. But he was aware, somewhere below the discipline, of something he hadn't expected to feel. Not relief. Not bitterness, exactly. Something more like the specific loneliness of a person who has done the right thing and is not yet sure what doing the right thing costs. He'd find out. He always did. The 48-hour review began at 10 in the morning, and Natalie ran it herself. This was not how these things were normally done. Normally, an incident review at this scale involved the legal department, the risk management team, the insurance liaison, and whichever senior VP had the cleanest hands relative to the event under investigation. Normally, the CEO received a summary document with recommendations attached and made a decision from there. Normally, the distance between the executive suite and the actual facts of a situation was managed carefully, because distance was protection, and protection was what lawyers were for. Natalie dismissed the lawyers at 10:17. She kept Harold keen. Harold had been expecting to be dismissed along with everyone else, had already half risen from his chair when she looked at him and said flatly, "Sit down, I need someone who actually knows this facility." He sat down. She also kept Derek, her assistant, who was useful in the way that good assistants were useful, not for what he contributed to the analysis, but for what he could retrieve. Digital records, archived emails, purchase order histories, internal communications. Derek was fast and thorough, and had the useful quality of not asking why he was looking for something before he found it. Victor was not in the room. Victor had been told the review was in progress, and that he would be contacted when his input was needed. He had objected, through 2 separate channels, in language that became progressively less diplomatic with each iteration. Natalie had read both communications, responded to neither, and returned to the documents in front of her. The first thing she asked Harold for was Ethan's maintenance reports. All of them. Every report filed under his employee number for the previous 18 months. Harold had anticipated this. He'd pulled them the night before, after the fire department left, because he'd been in this industry long enough to know that the paper trail was always where the truth lived, and he'd been in this particular company long enough to be worried about what the paper trail might show if someone with authority started looking at it seriously. He put the stack on the conference room table. Natalie looked at the stack, then at Harold. "How many?" 47 reports over 18 months. He filed them monthly plus supplementals when he identified specific issues. Most maintenance techs at his level file maybe 15, 18 in the same period. She pulled the stack toward her and started reading. It took her 3 hours to get through the reports, and in those 3 hours she marked 17 of them with a red pen. Not because they were wrong, but because they were right. And because being right about them in the way they were right meant that something else had gone very wrong somewhere else. The reports were meticulous. That was the first thing. They were written with the precision of someone who understood that documentation wasn't bureaucracy. It was the record that either protected people or failed them, and the difference depended entirely on how carefully you kept it. Every flagged issue had a date, a location reference, a description of the problem, an assessment of the risk level, and a recommended action. Every report had a submission timestamp and a supervisor receipt stamp. Casting pressure line 3 appeared for the first time in a report dated 9 months ago. Ethan had classified it as moderate high risk, recommended inspection within 60 days, and noted that the digital sensor monitoring that particular junction had a coverage gap that should be addressed regardless of the valve's condition. The same valve appeared again 4 months later. Risk classification had been upgraded to high. Recommended action had been upgraded to immediate replacement. The language of the report was still professional and neutral, but the upgrade in classification carried its own urgency in the way that understatement carries weight. It meant that whatever Ethan had seen in the 4 months between reports had moved him from concern to certain. A third report, 2 months after that, referenced the valve again in the context of a broader pressure management assessment. By this point, Ethan had also flagged 3 additional issues in the casting sector that were interconnected with the valve problem: the accuracy gap in the digital sensor, an anomalous vibration pattern in the secondary pressure housing, and the jammed release mechanism on the East Corridor emergency exit. All 4 issues documented, all 4 submitted through proper channels, all 4 stamped as received, none of them actioned. "Where do these go when they're submitted?" Natalie asked. She knew the answer, but she wanted to hear it from Harold. "Maintenance reports go to the department supervisor for review and action recommendation. From there, anything above a routine maintenance classification goes to operations management." Harold's voice was careful, even. The voice of a man delivering a verdict he'd already reached. "Victor Langford is head of operations." Natalie set down the report she was holding. "Pull his emails," she said to Derek. Derek looked at her. "His internal communications?" "His communications related to maintenance and safety reports. Yes." "I'll need an access authorization from—" "I'm the CEO," she said. "I'm authorizing it. Pull them." Derek pulled them. It took him 40 minutes, working with the IT department's records manager, who was nervous but compliant when the authorization came from Natalie's credentials directly. The relevant communications covered the same 18-month period as Ethan's reports. Derek organized them chronologically and put them in front of Natalie without comment, which was the right call. She read them for an hour and a half. The picture that emerged was not the picture of a man who had overlooked warnings. Oversight was careless but generally innocent. People failed to act on reports because they were overloaded or poorly organized or simply bad at their jobs. This was different. This was a man who had received warnings, understood them, and made a calculation. The first email that mattered was dated 8 months ago, 2 weeks after Ethan's initial valve report. Victor had forwarded the report to Corbett with a single line. "See attached. Maintenance is flagging pressure system issues again. Recommend we classify as monitoring priority rather than replacement priority, for now given Q3 capital constraints." Corbett had replied with 2 words. "Agreed, noted." The second email was more direct. 6 months ago, responding to a query from Harold Keene about the valve report's status, Victor had written, "Harold, we've reviewed Callaway's assessment and determined that the digital monitoring system provides adequate coverage for this issue. No capital expenditure approved at this time. Please advise your team that sensor calibration, not valve replacement, is the appropriate response." He had CC'd Corbett and the plant safety coordinator. He had not CC'd Harold's direct supervisor, which would have been standard procedure for a decision of this magnitude. He had also not CC'd Ethan, which meant Ethan had filed reports into a system that received them and then, as far as the person who filed them was concerned, produced silence. The third email was the one that changed the temperature in the room. It was 5 months old. It was from Victor to Corbett, and it was about the restructuring plan. Specifically, it was about the workforce reduction proposal. Victor laid out his argument in clear business-like language. Experienced maintenance technicians at the Callaway level commanded salaries and benefits that represented significant overhead against the cost of expanded automated monitoring. He projected that eliminating the night maintenance team and replacing it with 1 junior tech and upgraded digital sensors would save the company $1.2 million annually. He noted, in a single sentence near the bottom of the email, that this would also reduce the number of employees with the technical knowledge to identify discrepancies between digital sensor readings and actual mechanical conditions. He had not framed that last point as a problem. He had framed it as a benefit. Natalie read that sentence 3 times. Then she put the email down on the table and sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment, which was something she did when she needed her face to do something private before she returned to the business of being readable. Harold was watching her. He'd been watching her for the last hour, with the careful attention of a man who'd spent 31 years learning to read the rooms that decisions came out of. "He knew," Natalie said. "It wasn't a question." "He knew the sensor had a coverage gap," Harold said. "Whether he understood the full risk level is harder to—" "He knew," she said again. The second time was quieter and more certain than the first. He received a report classifying that valve as high risk, and he made a business decision to leave it in place because replacing it would cost money. He'd already decided the plant wasn't going to spend. And then he built a workforce reduction plan that would specifically eliminate the people most likely to catch the problem before it became a catastrophe. Harold said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. And when the catastrophe happened anyway, she continued, he tried to make it Ethan's fault. The room was very quiet. Outside the conference room windows, the Montana afternoon had gone the particular shade of gray that preceded snowfall. A uniform, pressing gray, the sky indistinguishable from the horizon. The plant floor below was partially operational, the sections unaffected by the casting sector shutdown running their normal schedules, because the people who worked those sections still needed their hours and the company still had orders to fill. Natalie looked at Harold. The emergency exit in the observation corridor, the jammed release. It's in his October report, Harold said. I pulled it before you got here. He flagged it as safety critical. Victor's response in the maintenance ticketing system was to classify it as a non-urgent repair and defer it to the next scheduled maintenance window. When was the next scheduled maintenance window? March. The fire had been in January. I was in that corridor, Natalie said. She said it without drama. Factually. The way you state a coordinate. Harold nodded slowly. I know. If Ethan hadn't known that exit was stuck. He'd been in that building 4 years, Harold said. He knew every broken thing in it. He knew it was stuck because he'd filed the report himself. She picked up the email again. The one about the workforce reduction. She read the bottom sentence one more time, then she put it down and looked at Derek. I need an independent engineering firm, not one of our regular contractors, someone with no prior relationship to Apex Meridian. I need a full post-incident inspection of the casting sector and a formal assessment of whether Ethan Calloway's emergency shutdown was the appropriate response given the conditions. Tonight, Derek said. First thing tomorrow. Tonight I want the documentation organized for the board. She looked at Harold. I also need to understand the sensor procurement, the digital sensors on the casting pressure line, who approved the purchase and which vendor supplied them. Harold shifted in his chair. That one's going to be interesting. Why? Because Victor approved a vendor change on the monitoring system sensors 8 months ago. Switched from the original equipment manufacturer to a third-party supplier, cost savings of about 40% per unit. And the engineering team's assessment of the switch? Harold reached into the folder he'd been carrying and produced a 2-page memo, which he slid across the table. Flagged as a potential accuracy concern. The engineering team's position was that the OEM sensors had a proven track record on this type of pressure line, and the third-party sensors, while compliant with minimum standards, had a narrower accuracy range under high-temperature conditions. Natalie looked at the memo. It was dated 7 months ago. The signatures at the bottom were the plant engineering team's. The approval signature at the top, the signature that had overridden the engineering team's concerns, was Victor Langford's. She thought about the digital board in the control room, showing green lights and normal pressure readings right up until the valve rupture. She thought about the analog gauge on the wall, showing something entirely different. She thought about Ethan standing at the master console, watching those two readings diverge, making a calculation in seconds that the entire digital monitoring system had failed to make. She thought about a voice, clear and flat and carrying no unnecessary urgency. Get off the floor. She closed the folder. I need to talk to Ethan Calloway, she said. Harold looked at her steadily. He resigned this morning. I know. I read the paperwork. She stood up. I need his address. The drive to Ethan's house took 22 minutes. Natalie drove herself, which surprised Derek, who'd offered to arrange a car. She wanted the 22 minutes. She wanted the road and the gray sky and the particular quality of thinking that came with moving through space without anyone watching her face. She thought about what she was going to say. She'd made offers before, had restructured departments, redirected careers, extended olive branches to people her organization had wronged. She was not unfamiliar with the uncomfortable arithmetic of trying to correct a mistake that had already cost someone something real. But those conversations had always been conducted with a degree of institutional remove. She was the CEO. The person across the table represented their own interests, and the negotiation was a negotiation. This was different, and she was honest enough with herself to know why. The Calloway house was modest, a single-story ranch on a half-acre lot with a porch that needed restaining and a truck in the driveway that had seen better decades and a propane tank at the side of the house that was about 60% full, which she noticed the way she'd noticed the cracked pressure housing and the flickering lights and the analog gauge on the wall, without intending to, because she'd spent the last 48 hours learning to look at the world the way Ethan looked at it, which meant looking at what was actually there rather than what the report said was there. She knocked. The door opened after about 15 seconds, and it was not Ethan. It was Sophie. Natalie had formed a mental image of Sophie from the phone conversation she'd overheard in the equipment corridor, a voice of pure enthusiasm describing blade pitch angles, a 7-year-old who talked about Bet's limit calculations with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who simply found it interesting and saw no reason everyone else wouldn't. The image in her head had been vague and impressionistic. The actual Sophie was small and dark-eyed, with her father's quality of stillness and her own quality of assessment. She was looking at Natalie with the frank, evaluative attention of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't looking. In her left hand, she was holding a drawing. She hadn't put it down to answer the door. Natalie could see it was a picture of a fireplace, drawn in orange and red crayon, with blue crayon snow outside the window. Along the bottom, in the careful, oversized printing of a 7-year-old who took handwriting seriously, Warm Beats Storm. "Hi," Sophie said. "Hi," Natalie said. "Is your dad home?" "Yeah." Sophie considered her for a moment. "You have a hurt wrist." "I do." "My dad did that." She gestured at the splint. "The wrapping part." "He did." Sophie processed this. "He wraps things good. He wrapped my ankle when I fell off the fence last summer. The doctor said it was better than what they would have done." A beat. "Are you from his work?" "I am." Natalie paused. "I was." She wasn't sure why she'd added that. Something in the child's directness made her own imprecision uncomfortable. Sophie seemed to understand something in the distinction, in the way children sometimes understood the shape of adult situations without the content. She stepped back from the door. "Dad, someone from work." Ethan appeared from the kitchen, drying his hands on a dish towel. He was in jeans and a flannel shirt, out of the work clothes for the first time since she'd seen him through her cracked SUV window in the blizzard dark. He looked different. Not softer exactly, but unarmored in some way that the work clothes and the factory context had covered. He stopped when he saw her. Not surprised exactly. Something more like a man adjusting his expectations to a reality that was slightly different than the one he'd been preparing for. "You drove out," he said. "I drove out," she said. A beat. "Come in," he said. Fussy. The inside of the house was what it was. Not messy, not particularly tidy, the functional disorder of a place that was genuinely lived in, where things ended up where they were used rather than where they belonged. There was a book on the kitchen counter with a coffee cup on top of it, acting as a bookmark. There was a child's wind turbine model on the kitchen table in 3 separate pieces, with a set of handwritten notes beside it in Sophie's printing. The pitch angle modifications, Natalie realized. Sophie had already started on the revisions. Ethan moved 2 coats off the couch so she could sit. Sophie had retreated to the kitchen table with her drawing and her turbine components, but hadn't left the room, which Natalie suspected was a calculation on the child's part rather than an accident. Ethan sat in the chair across from her. He wasn't going to make it easy by asking questions, she could see that. He was going to let her say what she'd come to say. "I spent today going through the maintenance records," she said, "and the emails, and the procurement files," she paused. "All of it." Ethan said nothing. "Your valve report was accurate. Your sensor gap assessment was accurate. The exit mechanism fault report was accurate." She looked at him directly. "Every major warning you filed was received and buried by Victor Langford, who simultaneously purchased cheaper sensors that reduced the monitoring accuracy on the pressure lines and built a workforce reduction plan that would have eliminated the people most likely to catch the problem." Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted slightly. Not surprise, she didn't think he'd be surprised by this. Something more like the particular settling of a person who has held a weight in an uncertain position and has finally been allowed to set it down. "The independent engineering assessment comes in tomorrow," she continued, "but it's a formality at this point. The documentation is conclusive. Your emergency shutdown was not only justified, it was the only decision that prevented a catastrophic failure with 12 people on the floor." She stopped. "You saved 12 people. And me. For the second time." "The second time was my own fault partly," Ethan said. "I should have confirmed everyone was clear before I went to the control room." She looked at him. You're accounting for that. I didn't confirm you'd left the building. I assumed. In that kind of situation, you don't assume. You were managing an emergency on a floor you were responsible for. Doesn't change the process failure. She was quiet for a moment. This was what she hadn't been prepared for. Not his competence, which she'd seen, but the specific quality of his honesty. He was not going to accept credit that was larger than what was accurate, and he was not going to decline responsibility for what was genuinely his. He was just going to be precise, even when precision meant holding himself to a standard that nobody else in the room was applying. Victor is being removed from his position, she said, effective immediately, pending a formal investigation that I expect will result in significant legal consequences for him personally. The workforce reduction plan is canceled. All positions are retained. She paused. I'm also authorizing immediate replacement of every critical pressure system sensor in the facility with OEM components, and a full inspection of every maintenance report that was classified as non-urgent in the last 2 years. Ethan looked at the floor for a moment. She couldn't read the expression exactly. It wasn't satisfaction, wasn't relief. Maybe something closer to the feeling of a thing becoming right that had been wrong for a long time, and not being certain how to hold that. That's the right call, he said, for the people working that floor. I know. She took a breath. I want you to come back. He looked up. His eyes were steady. He wasn't going to help her by looking uncertain about it. Not your old position, she said quickly. I'm not asking you to be a maintenance tech again. I'm asking you to take on something different. She'd been thinking about the wording for the last 22 minutes in the car. She still wasn't certain she had it right. Director of Emergency Systems and Plant Safety. You'd have full authority over the safety infrastructure of this facility. The authority to halt production at any point, for any reason, if you determine there is a risk to human life. No approval required, no override. Your call, full stop. The kitchen was quiet. Sophie had stopped arranging turbine components. She was holding a piece and not moving, which meant she was listening. That's not a role that exists at Apex Meridian, Ethan said. It will, starting Monday, if you say yes. He was quiet for longer than was comfortable. She let the quiet exist. There's a condition, he said. She'd expected this. Name it. Every worker who was on that termination list gets a formal written guarantee of continued employment with a 5-year protection clause. Not a verbal assurance, a document with the company's legal signature. If Apex Meridian wants to reduce workforce in that period, it goes through a process that includes an independent review and 60 days notice minimum. She hadn't expected that specific condition. She'd expected something about his own salary, his own authority, the resources allocated to the safety division. She'd been prepared to negotiate on those things. She had not been prepared for him to walk in the door of a negotiation and lead with protection for 32 other people. That's a significant legal commitment, she said. I know what it is. I'll need board approval for employment guarantee structures at that level. Then get board approval. His voice was not hard. It was simply clear, in the way that things are clear when the person saying them is not interested in discussing whether they mean it. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at her. In the kitchen, Sophie very quietly set down the turbine component she'd been holding. Okay, Natalie said. Something moved across his face, just briefly, just enough to see. Okay, he said. She stayed for another 20 minutes, during which they discussed the practical details of the transition, the inspection timeline, the board meeting schedule, the documentation she needed from him about the unresolved maintenance issues in the facility. She took notes on her phone with her left hand, the splinted right resting in her lap. At some point, Sophie got up from the table and brought them both a glass of water without being asked, which Ethan received with the natural ease of a man accustomed to small kindnesses from his daughter, and Natalie received with a warmth she hadn't prepared for. Thank you, Sophie, she said. Sophie studied her for a moment. Then, is your wrist going to be okay? The doctor says 6 weeks. Dad's knee took 8 weeks, Sophie said, with the information-sharing tone of a child who found medical timelines interesting. He heard it a long time ago. He doesn't talk about it, but it changes when it's going to snow. I can tell. Ethan gave his daughter a look that was not quite warning and not quite amusement. The look of a man who had not anticipated being accurately described by a 7-year-old. Sophie received the look and returned to her turbine components with a composure that Natalie found quietly extraordinary. When she stood to leave, Ethan walked her to the door. On the porch, in the cold, the snow had started, light and steady, the Montana kind that fell without drama and accumulated without apology. She turned back. "I need to say something," she said. "You don't have to." "I came to Montana to approve a restructuring plan," she said. "I had a list of names. I was going to sign off on it based on Victor's projections without ever setting foot on that plant floor, without ever speaking to a single person whose name was on it." She stopped. Not for effect. She stopped because she was trying to be accurate, and accuracy required care. "If you hadn't stopped on Highway 2 that morning, someone else would have," he said. "I'm not sure that's true." He considered that, in the porch light, in the falling snow. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the last 48 hours. He looked tired the way a person looks when they've been carrying things for a long time and have gotten so used to the weight that they've stopped noticing the effort. "You're building something different now," she said, "for this facility. I want you to know I understand what that means. The people there, they'll have something they didn't have before." "They should have had it all along," he said. "They should have," she agreed. She went down the porch steps. At the bottom she paused, her hand on the railing, the snow falling around her. She'd left her coat in the car, had come to the door without it, which in retrospect had been an error, and her blazer was inadequate for January in Montana in a way that she would have expected to have learned by now. "The drawing," she said, "your daughter's drawing, on the table." "She did it a few months ago," Ethan said, "after a power outage. We lost heat for half a day. She sat by the fireplace and drew it." Warm beat storm. "She's extraordinary," Natalie said. "I know," he said, simple and direct and without false modesty, the way a father says it, when it's just true. She walked to her car. She got in. She sat for a moment before starting the engine, watching the snow fall on Ethan Calloway's porch, on his driveway, on the Montana dark beyond his property line. She thought about the list of names, about the documents she'd carried on the plane from Chicago, the projections that had made the restructuring look like mathematics rather than decisions about people's lives, about the gap between the boardroom version of a company and the actual thing, the people inside it, doing the work, living with the consequences of choices made by people who never had to live with them. She'd built her career on understanding companies, on reading their numbers, their structures, their inefficiencies, their potential. She was good at it. She knew she was good at it. She was starting to understand that she'd been looking at the wrong things. She started the engine and pulled out of the driveway and drove back toward Kalispell through the falling snow. And the whole way there, she was thinking about what came next. The board meeting, the investigation, the restructuring of the restructuring. But underneath the thinking was something quieter, something that had less to do with the company and more to do with a porch light in the dark, and a father who had led with protection for 32 other people before he'd said a word about himself. She'd met a lot of people in boardrooms. She had not often met someone like that. The snow came down on the highway, steady and indifferent and cold, and the road ahead was long, and Natalie Harrington drove through it and thought about the difference between authority and strength, and what it cost to know the difference, and what it was worth when someone finally showed you. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning on a Thursday, and by 8:45 every seat around the Apex Meridian conference table in Chicago was filled. Natalie had been in this room hundreds of times. She knew the grain of the table, the angle of the morning light through the east-facing windows, the particular acoustic quality of a room designed for authority, the way sound moved differently here than in ordinary rooms, the way the architecture itself was engineered to make whatever happened inside it feel consequential. She'd presented in this room when she was 30, 3 months into her role, terrified and hiding it well. She'd defended budget decisions in this room, strategic pivots, acquisitions, divestitures. She knew how to use this room. Today, she intended to use it differently. The board of directors numbered 9. 6 men, 3 women, ranging from 58 to 74, the kind of people who had spent their careers accumulating the judgment that got you into a room like this, and the caution that kept you there. They were not bad people. Natalie had never believed that the people who made destructive institutional decisions were necessarily bad people. They were usually just people who had learned to trust numbers over faces, summaries over details, and the version of events delivered by whoever controlled the presentation. Today, she was controlling the presentation. Victor was in the room. She had insisted on it over the objections of the company's legal counsel, who had argued strenuously that having Victor present during an investigation review created exposure. Her position was that Victor had been present for everything that had preceded the investigation, and he would be present for the accounting of it. That was not a legal strategy. It was something else, something she couldn't quite name cleanly, but which had to do with the particular importance of not letting powerful people be absent from the consequences of their decisions. Victor sat 2 seats to her left, composed and gray-suited and holding a coffee cup with both hands. He'd brought his own attorney, who sat against the wall behind him. He had the look of a man who had prepared extensively and was confident in his preparation. Natalie opened without preamble. "I want to start with a number," she said. "Not a projected savings figure, not an efficiency ratio, a different kind of number." She looked around the table. 12. That's how many people were on the casting floor of our Montana facility at 2:47 in the morning 8 days ago, when a 40-year-old pressure valve on line 3 failed catastrophically. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. All 12 of them went home that night. None of them went to a hospital. None of them are in litigation with this company. None of their families received a phone call that would have changed their lives permanently. She paused again. That outcome was not the result of our safety systems working correctly. It was the result of one man working correctly, despite the fact that we had spent months building a case for why that man was expendable. Victor set down his coffee cup. Natalie pulled up the first document on the projection screen, Ethan's valve report from 9 months ago. She read the key sections aloud, the risk classification, the recommended action, the timeline. She moved through the subsequent reports without commentary, letting the dates and the escalating risk classification speak for themselves. Moderate high, 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 with additional interconnected failures identified. Then she pulled up Victor's email, the one about the workforce reduction plan. She read the relevant section twice, once at normal speed, once slowly, the way you read something when you want the room to understand that every word in it is intentional. The particular silence that followed was the kind that told her the room had understood. She moved through the procurement documentation next, the sensor vendor change, the engineering team's objection, Victor's override. She showed them the post-incident comparison between the digital sensor readings and the analog gauge readings in the 60 minutes before the rupture. She showed them the independent engineering firm's report, which had arrived the previous afternoon, and which used language that was careful and technical, and nonetheless arrived at conclusions that were not ambiguous. The emergency shutdown had been not only justified, but almost certainly the only intervention that had prevented a multi-casualty event and structural damage to the facility that the firm's assessment placed between $4 and $7 million. She showed them Ethan Callaway's personnel file. 4 years of performance reviews, all rated exceptional. The maintenance report history, 47 reports in 18 months, while the facility average was 15 to 18. A section of the independent engineering firm's supplemental notes that she had specifically requested, which addressed the question of whether Ethan's methodology, using analog gauges as a secondary check against digital sensor readings, monitoring harmonic frequencies in valve housings by touch and sound, represented best practice. The firm's assessment was unqualified. It was exactly the kind of redundant verification methodology that industrial safety standards recommended and that automated systems could not replicate. Then she pulled up the termination recommendation Victor had sent to her desk the morning after the fire. She put it on the screen next to the independent engineering report. She didn't say anything about the juxtaposition. She didn't need to. One of the board members, a woman named Patricia Weil, who had been on the board for 11 years and who Natalie had always found to be the most reliable reader of situations in the room, said quietly, "Victor, I want to hear from you. Walk us through your decision-making on the sensor procurement." Victor said, "I want to note that everything I did was within my operational authority and consistent with the company's cost management mandate." "I didn't ask about your authority," Patricia said. "I asked about your decision-making. Walk me through it." Victor looked at his attorney. The attorney gave him a small nod that meant, "You have to answer." What followed was 11 minutes of careful corporate language, the kind that was technically accurate at every individual point and fundamentally dishonest in its totality. Victor acknowledged the sensor change. He framed it as a reasonable cost management decision made in good faith based on the available information. He acknowledged receiving Ethan's reports. He characterized his response to them as consistent with standard triage protocols for maintenance requests, competing for limited capital resources. He used the phrase reasonable business judgment 4 times. He did not once use the word risk in a sentence where he was the subject. Natalie watched the board as he spoke. She watched faces. She'd spent her career watching faces in this room, reading what they showed and what they concealed. What she saw now was the look of people who were finishing the arithmetic. When Victor finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Arnold Cho, who had been on the board the longest and who spoke rarely and never carelessly, said, "The employee, Calloway. He resigned?" "He did," Natalie said, "and you've spoken with him since." "I drove to his home 2 days ago." She pulled up the last document on the screen, not an email or a report, but the proposal for the Director of Emergency Systems and Plant Safety position. The role she'd created. The employment guarantee clause for the 32 protected positions. The Independent Safety Review Authority. "This is what I'm asking the board to approve today." Arnold looked at the screen for a moment. He set his own terms? He set one condition, the employment guarantee for the other workers. Natalie looked around the table. "He didn't negotiate his own salary until I brought it up. He negotiated for 32 other people first." Patricia Weil made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Arnold leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling briefly, which Natalie had seen him do before when he was deciding something. The cost of the new role versus the cost of the incident outcome if the shutdown hadn't happened. "The independent firm's damage estimate is between 4 and 7 million, Natalie said, plus litigation exposure if any of the 12 workers had been injured, which the firm assessed would likely have exceeded 12 million in a worst-case scenario. And Victor's proposed workforce reduction would have saved 1.2 million annually by his own projection." She paused. "The man he was planning to fire saved the company somewhere between $16 and $19 million. Before we account for reputational damage from a major industrial casualty, which I won't attempt to quantify." The room was quiet again. The Montana kind of quiet. The kind that had weight. The vote on Victor's removal took 4 minutes to organize and 3 seconds to complete. Unanimous. His attorney was already closing his briefcase before the count was finished. Victor Langford stood up from the table without being asked. He was controlled in the way that certain kinds of people were controlled when the ground had finally shifted under them. Not grace, exactly, but the reflex of a man who had always managed his presentation and continued managing it even now. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his coffee cup, then appeared to reconsider and set it back down. He looked at Natalie for a moment. She looked back at him. He left the room. His attorney followed. The vote on the Director of Emergency Systems and Plant Safety position, the Employment Guarantee Clause, and the full safety infrastructure overhaul passed 8-1, the one dissent being a board member named Gregor Ames, who had concerns about the precedent of individual employment guarantees and who registered his dissent with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew he was losing and wanted it noted that he disagreed. Natalie was on the phone to Harold Keene before she'd left the conference room. "It's done," she said. "All of it. Victor's out. The positions are protected. The role is approved." A pause. "Is Ethan available today?" Harold's voice on the other end of the line was doing something she hadn't heard it do before. It took her a moment to identify it. He was smiling. "I'll call him," Harold said. "What?" Ethan received Harold's call at 11 in the morning, sitting on the floor of Sophie's room helping her recalculate the pitch angle on the wind turbine's replacement blades. Sophie had drawn a diagram on graph paper and was explaining why 4 degrees was the correct adjustment with the systematic patience of someone who had thought it through completely and expected the explanation to be self-evident once she'd laid it out. He listened to Harold with the phone against his ear, the graph paper in his other hand. "Board voted this morning," Harold said. "Victor's removed. All 32 positions are protected, legal guarantees, the whole structure. Your new role is approved." A pause. "She got everything you asked for, Ethan. Every piece of it." He looked at Sophie's diagram. The carefully drawn angle marks, the notes in the margins in her precise small handwriting. "Okay," he said. "That's still all you've got?" Harold said, with a warmth that made the question into something other than frustration. "It's good news, Harold. It's excellent news. It's the best news this plant has had in about 8 months. Tell her I'll be there Monday." We need to start with the pressure system sensor replacements and work backward through the October report before we do anything else. I'll tell her. And Harold. Yeah. Thank you. For the 31 years of doing this job right, it mattered. A long pause on the line. Get off my phone, Calloway, Harold said, roughly. Ethan hung up. He set the phone down on the carpet. Sophie was watching him with those dark eyes. Good news? She said. Good news. About work? About work. She considered this. Then she picked up her pencil and returned to her graph paper. Okay, so about the pitch angle. He listened to the pitch angle, all of it, start to finish, without interrupting, which was what she needed from him and what he was glad to give. The 3 months that followed were not a transformation. That word implied something cinematic and complete, a before and after, with a clean line between them, and that was not how it worked. What happened at the Montana facility over those 3 months was more like the gradual correction of something that had been running slightly wrong for so long that people had forgotten what right felt like. Ethan started on Monday morning, as promised. He started with the pressure system sensors, because the sensors were the most immediate risk, and because fixing them first was the message he needed to send. That this wasn't a ceremonial role, that the authority he'd been given was real, and he intended to use it for exactly what it was meant for. The OEM replacement sensors went in over 4 days. The digital monitoring system was recalibrated. The coverage gap at the casting pressure line junction, the one Ethan had flagged 9 months ago, was addressed with a secondary sensor node that he specified and installed himself, because he knew exactly what was needed, and doing it himself was faster and better than explaining it to someone else. The emergency exit on the observation corridor was repaired on day 2. That one he did personally, alone, on a Tuesday morning before the day shift arrived. He didn't make an announcement about it. He just fixed it and tested it 6 times and moved on. Over the following weeks, he worked through the October report systematically, every flagged issue, in order of risk classification. Some of the repairs required capital expenditure he had to justify to the new interim operations head, a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had been brought in from the Chicago office and who had the useful quality of asking good questions and accepting good answers. Some of the repairs were things he could do himself with the maintenance crew, no approval needed. He did those without waiting for approval. The maintenance crew, his old crew, worked with him differently now. Not because his title had changed, though it had. Because he'd shown them something that titles didn't confer. That when the situation required it, he would move toward the problem rather than away from it. And that the authority he'd been given he would use in service of the people who needed it, rather than as a thing to be accumulated and displayed. They trusted him before. Now they trusted him in the specific way that people trust someone who has proven they'll pay the cost of a hard decision when the hard decision is right. Tommy Reyes, who had been in the casting sector that night, and who had walked out when Ethan told him to walk out with the faith of someone extending it without fully knowing why, came to Ethan's office 3 weeks into the new arrangement and knocked on the doorframe. I've been thinking about going back to school, Tommy said. Engineering program, part-time. What kind of engineering? Industrial safety systems. He said it like he was expecting to be told it was a bad idea or an impractical one, or both. Ethan looked at him for a moment. The university in Missoula has a good program. I can tell you who to contact for the part-time track. Tommy blinked. Yeah? Yeah, come back this afternoon and I'll have the information. Tommy left. Ethan turned back to the pressure system documentation he'd been working through. He thought about that conversation for a while after Tommy was gone. About what it meant that a 24-year-old who'd been on the floor that night had decided that understanding safety systems was worth his time and money. About the particular way that events shaped people without their full awareness, the way a night in a burning factory could quietly reorganize someone's sense of what mattered. He thought about his own reorganization, the one that had started the night he drove home from a shift and saw headlights spinning across a highway. The independent engineering firm's final report on the incident was released publicly in February, 6 weeks after the board meeting. It received modest coverage in the industrial trade publications and a single mention in the Montana business press. It was not the kind of story that attracted wide attention in the way that disasters did. It was, by definition, a story about a disaster that hadn't fully happened, which was inherently less legible than one that had. The drama of prevention was always harder to tell than the drama of consequence. But within Apex Meridian, the report landed differently. Natalie had it distributed to every employee at the Montana facility, not as a corporate communication, but as a document, the actual engineering document, with its technical language and its specific findings and its conclusions. She'd added a single cover letter. It was short. It said that the company had made decisions that prioritized cost over safety, that those decisions had been wrong, and that the outcome had been prevented by one employee who knew the difference between what the instrument said and what was actually true, and who had acted on that knowledge at personal cost. It said that this was the standard the company intended to hold itself to going forward, and that it welcomed accountability from anyone who saw it falling short. Marcus Webb read the cover letter in the break room, at the table where he'd been eating lunch in this facility for 7 years. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket, which was not something he would have been able to explain if anyone had asked, but which felt like the right thing to do with something that should be kept. The safety record numbers came in at the end of March. Harold Keene brought them to Ethan's office on a Friday afternoon, in a folder, the way he brought everything, without digital fanfare, without email, just a folder and a knock on the door frame. Incident reports, Harold said. Quarter 1. Ethan opened the folder. 0 recordable safety incidents. 0 near-miss events in the categories that the new monitoring protocols tracked. Pressure system performance showing consistent accuracy across all lines. Digital and analog readings within acceptable variance on every check. Emergency system response times. The new protocol required quarterly drills, all within specified parameters. At the bottom of the report, Harold had handwritten a single line. Strongest Q1 safety record in company history. Ethan looked at it for a moment. Production numbers? He asked. Harold allowed himself a small expression that was close to satisfaction. Also up, 4% over the same quarter last year. He paused. Turns out when people aren't worried about whether the equipment is going to kill them, they work better. Imagine that, Ethan said. Harold left. Ethan sat with the folder for a moment, then put it in the filing cabinet and went back to work. Sophie's wind turbine won the state science competition in March, on a Saturday, in a gymnasium in Helena that smelled like floor wax and the particular industrial coffee of institutional events. Natalie flew in from Chicago the night before. She had not announced she was coming. She had called Harold, who had called Ethan, who had said nothing to Sophie because Sophie would have spent the intervening 48 hours anxious about having an audience rather than focused on her presentation, and Ethan knew his daughter. Sophie presented for 8 minutes to a panel of 5 judges, 2 of whom were engineers. Her pitch angle modification had increased the turbine's simulated efficiency by 11% over her original design. She explained the Betz limit, the relationship between blade geometry and tip speed ratio, and her specific design choices with the methodical clarity of someone who understood what they'd built and why every decision in it was the right one. The judges asked her 4 questions. She answered all 4 without hesitation and with the particular quality that distinguished the genuinely knowledgeable from the merely prepared. She answered them differently than she'd have answered them if they'd been asked 5 minutes earlier, because she incorporated the premise of each question into her response rather than just retrieving an answer she'd rehearsed. First place. Regional and state combined, elementary division. Ethan watched from the back of the gymnasium, standing against the wall the way he stood in most rooms. Available, attentive, taking up less space than his size would suggest. When Sophie's name was called and she went up to receive the award and stood on the small stage with the certificate and the somewhat aggressive handshake of the competition director, he watched her the way he'd watched her every significant moment of her life, with a fullness behind his sternum that he'd never found the right word for. Natalie was standing 2 feet to his left. He hadn't looked at her in the last few minutes because he'd been watching Sophie. When he did look, he found that she was not watching Sophie. She was watching him watch Sophie. He met her eyes. She looked away first. Then she looked back. "She's extraordinary," she said quietly. The same thing she'd said on his porch in January. "I know," he said. The same answer. But it was different now, the exchange. It carried the weight of everything that had happened between those 2 moments, the weight of what they'd been through and what they'd built from it, and what was still being built, carefully, without rushing it, without pretending it was something other than what it was. There was something between them that had no clean name, It wasn't the emergency bond of two people who'd survived the same bad night, though that was part of it. It wasn't the professional respect that had developed through the investigation and the board meeting and the 3 months of working toward the same thing, though that was part of it too. It was something that had grown in the margins of all those other things, in the 22-minute drive she'd made to his house, in the conversation on his porch in the snow, in the phone calls about sensor specifications that somehow ran 20 minutes longer than the sensor specifications required. Something slow and unsentimental and real. Neither of them had said anything directly about it. That felt right. Some things needed to develop at their own pace, and rushing them was its own kind of damage. In late April, on a Saturday evening, Natalie drove up from Kalispell on a 2-lane road she was beginning to know well. She'd been in Montana twice in the last month, more than the operational needs of the facility strictly required, though she could justify each trip on operational grounds, and did. Ethan had said, "Come for dinner." Sophie's idea, he'd noted, which was probably true and probably not the whole story. The cookout was in the backyard, in the early spring cold that Montana offered in late April. Not the killing cold of January, but the kind of cold that required a jacket and made the fire worth having. Ethan had built a fire in the stone ring at the back of the yard, the kind of fire that was genuinely for warmth rather than atmosphere, and Sophie had positioned her chair close enough to it that she was actively absorbing heat rather than just benefiting from it. Natalie arrived in the red flannel coat she'd bought in Kalispell the week after the blizzard, because her cashmere coat had not survived the incident and she'd needed something that was actually designed for Montana. She'd worn it since without giving it particular thought. Ethan noticed it. She could see that he did. They ate burgers that Ethan grilled with the focused attention he gave to everything physical and mechanical, the kind of attention that produced reliable results rather than perfect ones, because the goal was correctness rather than performance. Sophie ate half her burger and then abandoned it to explain a modification she was planning for the wind turbine's base mounting system, using a stick to draw diagrams in the dirt at the edge of the firelight. "She does this at every meal," Ethan said, in the tone of a man making an observation rather than a complaint. "At school too," Sophie said, without looking up from her diagram. "Mrs. Howell says I can't use the whiteboard during lunch anymore." "That seems fair," Natalie said. "It's inefficient," Sophie said. "Lunch is 40 minutes. I'm just sitting there." Natalie looked at Ethan. I was looking at his daughter with an expression she'd come to recognize, the one he didn't quite manage to contain, the fullness behind it that he didn't talk about because it was too large to talk about and too essential to pretend didn't exist. The fire crackled and settled. The Montana dark pressed in at the edges of the firelight, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're too big to be about you. Sophie went inside eventually, with the pragmatic decisiveness of a child who knew when adults needed time that wasn't about her. She'd said goodnight with a hug for her father and a look at Natalie that was appraising in a way that was not unfriendly, the look of a child who was deciding something, though what exactly she was deciding she didn't say. Ethan and Natalie sat by the fire. It wasn't uncomfortable, the quiet. It was the kind of quiet that existed between people who'd run out of the need to fill it. "The scholarship program," Ethan said eventually. He'd seen the announcement. Natalie had established a scholarship fund for children of hourly workers at Apex Meridian's facilities, directed toward engineering and technical education. Sophie's turbine project had been the catalyst. "You didn't tell me you were doing it." "I didn't need your permission," she said. "No, but you could have mentioned it." She looked at the fire for a moment. "I wanted to do something that didn't require your agreement, something that was just the right thing to do, without making it part of a negotiation." He was quiet. Then, "That's a distinction you didn't used to make." She looked at him. It was a direct observation, not a criticism, and she took it as what it was. "No, it's not a distinction I used to make." She paused. "Montana's been educational. Cold educational. The worst kind." He almost smiled. Almost. She pulled the flannel coat tighter around her shoulders. The fire had banked down some, the logs settling into coals that gave heat without light. Above them, the Montana sky was doing what it did on clear nights, presenting itself without restraint, more stars than the Chicago sky ever offered, the kind of sky that made you aware of the size of things in a way that was either comforting or terrifying depending on what you brought to it. I want to ask you something, Natalie said. Okay. Are you happy with the role, the work, all of it? Actually happy, not just willing to continue. He thought about it. She'd noticed he did that, actually thought about questions rather than producing the available answer. It was one of the things she'd come to depend on, the reliability of his honesty about things other people would have made more comfortable. The work is right, he said. I know how to do it and why it matters and who it's for. That's more than most people get. A pause. The rest of it, I'm working on. The rest of it being. He looked at her across the fire. She looked back. Yeah, he said. It wasn't an elaborate statement. It didn't need to be. The thing about people who didn't waste words was that the words they used carried more than their dictionary weight, and she'd learned to hear the freight in his particular economy of language. She nodded. She looked back at the fire. Okay, she said. They sat there for a while longer in the warmth of the coals and the cold of the Montana night, neither of them rushing toward or away from anything. There was time. That was something she'd learned too over these months, that not everything needed to be decided immediately, that some things built themselves correctly when you let them build at their own speed and didn't impose a timeline because you were uncomfortable with the uncertainty. In January, she had come to Montana to decide which people were expendable. She had found instead a man who didn't know how to be expendable, not because he was arrogant about his worth, but because he'd organized his life around the understanding that the people around him were not expendable, and that understanding had made him indispensable in ways that no spreadsheet could capture and no restructuring plan could account for. He hadn't taught her that with a speech. He'd shown her with a stopped car in a blizzard, a fire blanket in a burning corridor, a resignation letter filed before the fight was over because the fight had stopped being about him, and a negotiation where the first condition was protection for 32 people he hadn't needed to protect. People talk about leadership as though it's a quality you acquire through position, through education, through the accumulation of enough authority that people have to follow you. What Natalie understood now, not as an idea, but as a fact she'd watched work in real time, was that the people worth following were the people who had stopped needing to be followed, who would have done the same thing whether anyone was watching or not, whether they were getting credit or not, whether it cost them or not. Ethan Calloway had been that person long before she arrived in Montana. He'd been that person in the cold water off the highway, on the floor of a burning factory, in the equipment corridor with a phone pressed to his ear and his face doing something it couldn't help doing when his 7-year-old daughter told him she'd gotten her calculations right. She was glad she'd seen it. She was glad she'd stopped being the person who would have signed the paper without looking. Inside the house, through the kitchen window, she could see Sophie's light still on. The child who should have been asleep was probably at her desk, probably with graph paper, probably working on something that would need explaining in the morning with the stick diagram and the systematic patience of someone who found it self-evident once laid out properly. Ethan saw the light too. She's not asleep, he said. I know. She does this. She goes to bed and then she works. Where did she get that from? He looked at Natalie, the near smile that sometimes made it all the way to actual. Go home, Sophie, he said, at a volume that wouldn't carry through the walls but that was addressed to her all the same, the way parents address their children across distances, across walls, across years. The light went out. They both looked at the window for a moment. Then they looked at the fire. Then they looked at each other in the way of two people who have figured out what they are to each other and are taking their time about saying it out loud, because some things are worth the patience and some things are ruined by the rush. The Montana night held them in its enormous dark. The coals breathed their slow orange heat. Somewhere up the valley, a wind was moving through the pines, the sound of it reaching them a moment after the trees had already answered it, the way all echoes work, the world catching up to what has already happened. And in the modest yard of a modest house on the edge of a small Montana city, a former Navy SEAL who had carried a stranger through a blizzard and stopped a burning machine and walked away from a fight he'd already won. That man sat beside a fire with a woman who had come to his state intending to make him disappear and was glad, in the specific and unguarded way that glad feels when it's real, that the world had not cooperated with her plan. He had Sophie. He had work that was worth doing. He had this, whatever this was becoming, and he had the patience to let it become it properly. That was enough. For the first time in a long time, enough was not a consolation. It was just true.